if you stood beside me in Alfred's Wessex. Close your eyes for a moment and trade the modern world for the damp, iron-scented air of 9th century England. Imagine the ground beneath your boots is not pavement, but chalk and clay, churned by hooves and soaked by winter rain. In the distance, you hear it, the low, constant sound of an anxious kingdom. Axes biting into timber, hammers on iron, prayers whispered in smoke-dark halls, and beyond all that, the ever-present rumor of sails. This is the age of King Alfred of Wessex, an age where maps are more memory than ink, where a river can be a lifeline or a trap, and where a single fortified town can mean the difference between a harvest and hunger. If you were there with me, if you marched when the beacons flared, if you stood in the shield wall when the ground trembled with the enemy's advance, you would not remember it as a simple tale of Saxons versus Vikings. You would remember it as a hard education in landscape, logistics, fear, and endurance, marshland that swallows men, winter that kills quietly, and courage that is often just doing your duty when your stomach knots and your hands won't stop shaking. I'm going to tell you what I saw as a soldier in Alfred's service, where we went, how the land shaped every decision, what the battle sounded like up close, and how a kingdom learned to survive by changing itself. Listen like you're sitting beside a hearth while the wind presses at the shutters, because by the end, you'll understand something vital. Wessex did not endure by luck. It endured because ordinary men were made into a system of roads, burhs, watchmen, and will, and because Alfred refused to accept that England's story would end in smoke. Before we begin, a quick note. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe and leave a like on this video. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it tells me you want more stories like this. More campaigns, more centuries, more lives lived on the knife edge of history. Now, come with me. Chapter 1, The Kingdom of Chalk, Wood, and Watchfires. If you were with me in Wessex at the start of Alfred's reign, the first thing you'd notice is how the land itself feels like a fortress and a corridor at the same time. To the north and east, the country opens toward the Thames and the old Roman roads, useful for marching, dangerous for defense. To the south and west, you get rolling downs of pale chalk, dense woods, and the wet, shifting edge of the Somerset Levels. Every ridge is a lookout. Every river is a boundary line written in water. I was not a professional soldier in the way you might picture today. In Wessex, most of us were bound to service by obligation. The fyrd, the levy, meant that when the summons came, you left the plow, the forge, the fishing nets. You brought what you owned and what your lord could supply. Some men had mail shirts handed down, like family relics. Many of us had little more than a spear, a sayax at the belt, a round shield of wood and iron boss. The spear mattered most. In the crush of bodies, the spear is reach, and reach is life. And the summons came often. You have to understand what the great heathen army meant in practical terms. It wasn't just a raid. It was a moving machine of hunger and intent. Men who knew rivers, knew wintering, knew how to seize horses and force terms out of fear. They took towns not only to loot them, but to hold them. They would ride out, burn a church, strip a village, and vanish back into a fortified camp by nightfall. A kingdom could feel intact in the morning and hollow by dusk. When Alfred became king, the realm was already strained. His brother King Ethelred had fought hard and bled for it. We marched through country that still smelled of old fires. You'd see blackened beams in a field and know a hall had stood there a year ago. You'd see a monastery with its doors broken and its books scattered, and you'd understand why Alfred later spoke so fiercely about learning. Because losing books wasn't just losing words. It was losing memory, law, prayers, the thread that holds a people together. On campaign, we moved the way the land allowed. In winter, the roads were rivers of mud. In summer, dust rose from the track and stuck to sweat. We used ridgelines for speed and sight, chalk downs where your eyes could travel far. We used the forest edges for cover, places where you could hide 100 men if you kept them quiet. And we watched the waterways constantly because the Danes followed water like wolves follow scent. In battle, if you were beside me, you would learn how small your world becomes. Not armies in the abstract, just the man on your left with his shield, the man on your right breathing through his teeth, and the line in front of you where spear points wag like the quills of a threatened beast. The shield wall is not poetry. It's carpentry and pain. It is shoulders pressed tight, shields overlapping, feet braced in earth that turns slick with trampled grass and spilled blood. The noise is what surprises most people. You expect shouting, and yes, there is shouting, but it's also the dull thud of wood on wood, the scrape of iron on rim, the wet sound when a blade finds a gap, the hoarse prayers that leak out of men who didn't think they were praying until they realized they might die. We fought across familiar names that meant nothing to me as a boy and everything to me as a soldier, places tied to ridges, fords, and crossroads. You don't choose a battlefield in this age the way you imagine generals choosing. The battlefield chooses you. It is where you catch the enemy, where you can keep your line from being turned, where your retreat isn't a slaughter. And always, always the fear behind the fear, that if we break, it's not just soldiers who die, it's farms, families, food, stores, the next winter. What made Alfred different, even early on, even when he was young and the pressure was brutal, was that he watched more than the enemy. He watched us. He watched what failed. He watched how long it took for men to arrive, how quickly a rumor could empty a village, how often the Danes struck where we were not. It was as if he was already building a plan in his mind, piece by piece, while we were still reacting. If you had stood near him then, you wouldn't have seen a man born to easy confidence. You would have seen discipline. You would have seen a king who listened more than he boasted, who understood that a kingdom is not saved by one heroic day, but by making it harder and harder for disaster to find purchase, and disaster, I promise you, still found us. Chapter 2, Chippenham and the Marsh, How a Kingdom Hid to Survive. If you were with me the winter the Danes struck at Chippenham, you would remember the cold first. Not a neat storybook cold, an English wet cold that sinks into wool and stays there, that makes your fingers clumsy, that turns sleep into a shiver you can't escape. We thought we understood danger by then. We had fought, negotiated, regrouped. We had made peace and watched peace fray. But this was different. The attack came hard and fast. One of those moments where history feels like a door kicked in. Chippenham was a royal center, a place of authority, stores, and shelter. When it fell, it wasn't just a town taken. It was the feeling that the enemy could reach into the heart of Wessex and squeeze. People scattered, some fled overseas. Many submitted, because submission is what you do when your children are hungry and the nearest armed help is days away. I don't judge them. If you had seen what I saw, smoke rolling over winter fields, livestock driven off, men dragged from doorways, you would understand that courage isn't evenly distributed. It depends on whether you have options. Alfred did not vanish, but he did something that seems strange until you understand the geography. He withdrew into the marshes of Somerset. The Levels are not a simple swamp. They are a living maze, water channels, reed beds, raised islands of firmer ground, fog that turns distance into guesswork. To an invader who rides hard and expects roads, the marsh is a slow punishment. Horses stumble. Armor becomes heavy. Direction is uncertain. And if you don't know which patches hold you and which swallow you, you can die without a blade touching you. We followed him there, those of us who could. Our camp, if you can call it that, was a harsh education in survival. We lived on wet ground, on scarce food, on the discipline of silence. Smoke draws eyes, noise draws scouts. We built small defenses, not proud walls, but practical ones. Timber, earth, whatever, could be shaped fast. If you were there, you would see the war change shape. This was not open battle. This was raiding and counter-raiding, striking supply lines, ambushing small groups, taking what we needed and denying the enemy comfort. It is an ugly kind of war because it does not reward bravery so much as patience and caution. But it kept us alive long enough for something more important: time. Time for messengers. Time for loyalty to harden again. Time for the shock of defeat to turn into anger. And then came the call. We gathered not in a grand city, but at a meeting point that mattered because it could be reached. Because in a fractured kingdom, reachability is strategy. Men came from Somerset, Wiltshire, Hampshire, men with tired faces and repaired shields, men whose farms had been threatened but not erased, men who were ready to stop running. If you had been with me on that march out of the marsh, you would feel the shift in the air. The land rose, the ground firmed, the road stopped trying to steal our boots, and with every mile, the idea returned that Wessex could still stand in the open. The battle that followed Edington in the year 878 was not glorious in the clean way songs pretend. It was decisive because it forced the enemy into a corner of necessity. The Danes were fierce fighters, experienced, coordinated. They knew how to pressure a line, how to punch with axes and then exploit the gap. But we had something we hadn't possessed in months: concentration of force, and a king who understood the moment was not for cleverness. It was for endurance. If you stood in the shield wall that day, you would learn what a line feels like when it holds. You'd hear the impact ripple through the shields like a drumbeat. You'd taste iron in your mouth, not blood at first, but that metallic panic that comes when your body pours itself into survival. You would see faces inches away, enemy and friend, each trapped in the same brutal math. Push or be pushed, stand or collapse. When the enemy yielded, it did not feel like fireworks. It felt like the ground finally exhaling. Afterward came the siege. Because winning the field is one thing, breaking the will of a trapped army is another. Hunger is a weapon. Time is a weapon. When the terms came, they were not a fairy tale surrender. They were a settlement shaped by the reality that neither side could erase the other overnight. I watched Alfred insist on structure and oaths, not because he believed words were magic, but because words, public words, witnessed words, can become tools. In that era, baptism and oath-taking were not only religious acts, they were political binding, a way to turn personal honor into public constraint. And if you ask what I felt then standing amid the aftermath, mud, exhaustion, the quiet moans of the wounded, I'll tell you plainly, relief? Yes. Pride? Yes. But also a sober understanding that the war had taught Alfred something deeper than win a battle. It had taught him that Wessex needed to become a machine that could not be surprised again. Chapter 3. The Burhs, how Wessex turned earth into a weapon. If you were with me in the years after Edington, you would be surprised by how much of soldiering was not fighting, but building. Alfred's genius, if you want to use that word, was not only tactical, it was administrative. He began to treat defense like a network, not an occasional emergency. This is where the landscape becomes almost a character in the story. Wessex is threaded with rivers, the Thames to the north, the Avon, the Test, the Itchen, and countless smaller waters that can become highways for raiders. Roman roads still cut across parts of the land, straight lines of old empire, useful for marching, but also dangerous because they make movement predictable. Alfred's answer was to place fortified settlements, burhs, so that no part of key territory was too far from refuge and resistance. If you had walked with me to one of these places, say Winchester, or a fortified town on a river crossing, you would see earthworks rising like deliberate scars across the landscape. Banks piled high, ditches cut deep, timber palisades, gates engineered not for beauty, but for bottlenecking an attacker. Inside, you'd find stored grain, workshops, smiths hammering out rivets and blades, and the quiet bustle of people who understood that safety now had a geography. The burh is more than a wall. It's a promise that when raiders come, you don't have to gamble everything on catching them in the open. You can deny them easy targets. You can force them to waste time, and time, again, is a weapon. Alfred changed the fyrd too. If you were in the ranks with me, you'd notice that service began to feel less chaotic. Men were organized so that some could defend while others tended fields. That matters more than most people realize. An army that starves is not an army. It is a crowd waiting to die. By rotating service, Alfred tried to keep the kingdom fed while keeping it armed. There were other changes you'd hear about. Even as a common soldier, ships, more and better than before, built to contest the Danes on the water. Coin and law and written orders traveling more reliably, and perhaps, surprisingly, learning. Alfred cared about texts because governance depends on clarity. Land grants, obligations, legal judgments. In a time when chaos could swallow truth, writing was a kind of fortification too. You might wonder what daily life looked like inside this system. Let me tell you the details you would actually notice. You would notice the smell of tar and fresh-cut oak near shipyards. You would notice the way sentries scan not only for enemies, but for smoke. Because smoke is the first signal of a raid. You would hear horns and see beacons practiced, not only lit in panic. You would see roads maintained not as conveniences, but as arteries of response. And you would notice something else, the psychological shift. Before, many of us fought with this feeling that the next disaster could come from anywhere, at any time, and we would always be a step behind. After the burhs, after the reorganized fyrd, after the pattern of defense began to harden, the kingdom felt less like prey. It felt like a place with teeth. That didn't make life easy. It made it sustainable, as because the Danes did not vanish. The Danelaw existed to the north and east, a reality that shaped trade, travel, and tension. There were markets where languages mixed, where coins changed hands with a careful eye. There were borders where a small mistake could ignite violence. Wessex lived beside an enemy that was sometimes a neighbor. But Alfred's aim, what you would understand if you watched him long enough, was to buy the future, not only for himself, but for successors. A kingdom that can hold its ground long enough can begin to choose its battles instead of being chosen by them. And then, when the next great wave came, we discovered whether the machine truly worked. Chapter 4. The Second Storm, when the system was tested. If you were with me in the 890s, you would feel the old dread return because the raids grew into something heavier again. More ships, more men, more determination. This wasn't merely opportunistic violence. It was an attempt to break Wessex's new spine. The difference now was that Wessex did not react like a startled animal. It moved like a trained body. When reports came, sightings along coasts, movements up rivers, the burhs became anchors. We didn't have to guess where to run. We didn't have to abandon everything to chase shadows. Garrisons held walls. Field forces gathered with more purpose. Roads carried messengers faster. Supplies could be concentrated. It wasn't perfect. Nothing is in war, but it was a transformation. Let me give you the kind of scene you would actually witness. You're posted near a river crossing where raiders might try to push inland. The morning is gray. The water is high. You can smell wet earth and wood smoke from a nearby hearth. A rider arrives, breathless, carrying news. Within hours, men appear from farms and villages, not as a panicked mob, but as a levy that knows where to assemble. You watch them filter into the burh, some to hold the wall, some to join a marching force. Then you march. Not in a heroic line with banners fluttering like paintings. Most days, it's trudging, checking gear, watching the tree line, listening for distant shouting. But when contact comes, it comes sharply. A skirmish near a ford. A sudden clash on a narrow road where shields scrape hedge branches. A pursuit that becomes dangerous the moment you lose formation. And always the Danes searching for the old weaknesses, speed, surprise, division. Sometimes they tried to establish fortified camps. Sometimes they tried to lure us into overextending. They understood, like Alfred did, that an army isn't defeated only by death. It's defeated by exhaustion, hunger, and mistakes. But now we could do something that had been harder before. Contain. If an enemy force moved inland, they could not simply live off the land without consequence. Burhs blocked them. Garrisons threatened their rear. Field forces could shadow them while other units protected harvests and crossings. The war became, in a strange way, more strategic and less purely reactive. You would still see brutality. Farms burned despite all efforts. People killed for resisting. The raw cruelty of a raid never disappears just because a kingdom has plans. But you would also see resilience become normal. Villages rebuilding quicker, markets continuing, smiths working through the night. The sense that the kingdom had learned how to be wounded without bleeding out. And through it all, you would sense Alfred aging, not in weakness, but in weight. The man carried a burden of attention that never rested. Every report mattered. Every delay had consequences. Every winter demanded preparation. His victories were not only on battlefields, but in the relentless organization of survival. If you ask me what stayed with me most from those later years, it wasn't a single duel or dramatic moment. It was the understanding that we were living through an invention, the invention of a more defensible England, not a nation in the modern sense, not yet. but a framework. Fortified nodes, coordinated service, contested waterways, a king who tied learning and law to defense because he knew that a people without structure can be shattered by pressure. And when the storms eased, as storms sometimes do, you could stand on a rampart at dusk and look out over fields that were still planted, still green, still alive. You'd see smoke rising from hearths, not as alarms, but as supper. You'd hear the distant bark of dogs and the low sound of cattle, ordinary life returning like a tide. That, more than anything, is what victory felt like. Not triumph. Continuity. So if you were there with me, if you had walked the chalk downs, crossed the cold rivers, crouched in the Somerset marsh, and pressed your shield into the man beside you at Edington, you would leave with one clear truth. Alfred's Wessex survived because it learned faster than it bled. It turned geography into strategy, labor into defense, and fear into discipline. And in a century where so many kingdoms vanished, that is no small thing. Closing, if you enjoyed this kind of documentary-style historical storytelling, subscribe to the channel and like the video. It's the simplest way to support the work, and it tells me you want more. More eras, more campaigns, more lives narrated from the inside. Thank you for listening.